Okay, so this is for my psychology project, and the title is Overpopulation, Overabundance, and the Importance of Social Roles in Maintaining Societal Balance. And for the case study, I'm using Calhouns' rat Utopia. And for the non-experiment, I'm using Fordlandia. Starting with just a modern example. Internet culture, is I think exemplary of those who have become socially fragmented as a result of perceived online loyalties, only to end up disgraced. And this has resulted in several examples of individuals who regarded themselves as disaffected to such an extent that they believe they need to lash out to society through, say, gun violence or sexual assault, as they believe that the entitlement they garnered while online is enough to justify going so far as to take a life, or convince themselves that all women are the same, ergo should be treated like automatons fresh off the factory line. Needless to say, this dehumanizes most involved. And the individuals who have gone from internet nobodies to notoriously callous criminals who most likely wouldn't have done so if they couldn't meet their fundamental needs, like shelter, food, safety, and a meaningful social role. Could be prevented, but that's just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Now, I'll start with Calhoun's rat experiment, or his mouse Utopia or rat Utopia experiment, that led him to the idea of this concept called the behavioral sink. Now, Calhoun's studies that led to his formation of the concept he referred to as this behavioral sink, which I'll get into a little bit later, typically entailed him devising a penultimate utopia for Norwegian lab rats, 2,500 in total. This meant a home free from predators or any natural threats, as they were provided with a very secure shelter on a rural farm where they essentially had everything they required to sustain themselves in what would otherwise be one might think to just be what they required to live in a rat paradise, but was the outcome far from anything resembling a grand feat of behavioral improvement and contentment from abundance and safety, something that, interestingly enough, comes into conflict with Maslow's hierarchy, albeit Maslow was referring more to basic fundamental needs being met, whereas Calhoun provided not just sanctuary but readily accessible dietary adequacy, but did so deliberately to the point, not just abundance, but to the point where the rats need not worry about anything but themselves, a crucial factor that demonstrates the difference in the models proposed and applied by the two. His experiments were numerous, with initial studies being funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, where he created smaller scale environments that for trials previous to his big famous one with 200 rats, that this is the one I'm going to focus on, where he built on this farm 100 by 101 inch cage on a farm in 1972, where food and water was regularly replenished without any actions required on behalf of the test subjects, whom were provided with a safe haven from disease and other threats. He went so far as to call this little slice of rodent heaven the morality inhibiting environment for mice. And it was what he deemed experiment 25 that really drove home the point he was getting at as to when the population reached a plateau of 2200, a steep decline occurred as this once beyond habitable environment became a stomping ground for the domineering and more physically equipped and adept rats. A splintering effect occurred where, not unlike a tribal mentality of male prison gangs based around racial affiliation, these rats began to display the typical distinctive types of behavior that resulted in them being placed in one of three classes. The probers is a term for the large, aggressive, domineering group that essentially were the only ones feared enough to enjoy the resources available to them, and who earned their title for obsessively just it was like pruning themselves, grooming themselves, when they had nothing else to do, but otherwise they'd spend their time bullying, brutalizing both physically and sexually both sexes of rats to the point of excess, and ran all the other rats into a state of either deliberate hiding, the meek ones or smaller males, or just, which were the other male rats, smaller than these ones, or disorientation and abandonment of parental motivations in the females. They resorted to cannibalism, rape, and essentially crushed the weaker rats, even the female subjects who were pregnant, which led to a steep population drop, but I'll get into that a bit later. The weak ones are somnambulous, given this term for the tendency they had towards uneven eating habits, regardless of the fact that each feeding area was distributing equal amounts of food as they were attempting to form alliances, which they sometimes maintained for short periods of time, where they would go around in a dazed state that almost seemed to exude to Calhoun a sense of pride, where they were often unchallenged but would inflict violence upon other rats while ceasing to defend any territory or the females they had once impregnated, until they seemed to realize the inferiority they had in the face of the precious / beautiful ones, and they would hide away until the hours where, the probers, not the precious and beautiful ones, and would hide away until the hours where the space was mostly unoccupied before coming out to slake themselves on the nutrients that were still being steadily provided. Occasionally they would be observed to pick on pregnant females and either beat them until the pregnancy was terminated, or just unabashedly devour them and the fetus. Calhoun suggested that it was a lack of fulfilling social roles that left them to wander around without any apparent purpose or care for those around them. And then the female rats, which he labeled as the precious, beautiful ones, demonstrated characteristics similar to the inferior males who had just kind of checked out. They had become distant, withdrawn, sexually uninterested to the point of displaying asexual tendencies, most likely due to the constant trauma of sexually inflicted violence upon them, and who did not care for their children and they were successfully born and traversed the span of the study's environment to great detriment as they were tormented, pillaged, beaten, and those who did birth successfully found that their offspring seemed to show nearly none of the traits of the species would ordinarily display, as the formation of antisocial behavior, self-reliance on food, and pruning as their desires turned from motherly duties to simply grooming themselves incessantly. Thus, most of the young rats that weren't mauled to death while in the womb didn't last long. Once these groups were formed, the authoritarian males would stake their claim over certain territories, and they dominated the center pens where the density grew. This is where the behavioral sink idea began to form in Calhoun's mind, as aberrant social activity meant that they fell short on nest building and being targets for males. Often were so persecuted by male rats that they gave up on what would otherwise be maternal duties that they would take on organically when in a different habitat. Calhoun began to constantly reference the book of Revelations and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse as he witnessed this unbelievable carnage, which led to an expedient population dwindling that all but by 600 days, only a few dozen of these rats were left, or only actually less than a dozen. Sorry. The mounting savagery led to this steep dive into and this group clustering, population-wise, and ultimately into degradation and stagnation that spelled not just the mortal death, but what Calhoun deemed a spiritual death, had wrought the subjects to the point where only those with a semblance of security could attain what they regarded as an important social role that more so resembled self-righteousness and entitlement, and who would waltz around unfazed by the fatalities surrounding them, as well as the clear inability for the females to build new nests and rear young, contrarily even driving off their young and constantly attempting to build new nests before abandoning their work and seeking a new space. This was the death phase, according to Calhoun, where population withered to the point of extinction, with only a few stragglers remaining, and the feasibility of them restoring their population was impossible since, as I said, there's less than a dozen remaining, and those dozen were corrupted by the horrors of what they'd been exposed to, and this had changed their behavior into not what you typically expect from such rats, but something more barbaric and self-worshipping, self-righteous in their demeanors, with no desire to engage in healthy society-building activities. It was from these qualities and the downfall, which took a mere 600 days, that Calhoun reached a conclusive concept that he referred to as behavioral thing, the society-compromising attribute that led to the downfall of his utopian creation that spiraled into selfish madness that he imputed to a lack of any clear, meaningful social role that created a social web in which healthy social interactions can occur. Other studies were carried out in response, and patterns that mirror his studies have been seen in an example involving prisoners in a densely populated prison or enclosed space, and the opulence of other inhabitants, while under similar conditions, resulted in starvation, psychosis, sporadic violent outbursts among inmates, and the decision on behalf of many prisoners to withdraw from the environment where they became apathetic to the point of dissociation, mirroring the splintering of the rats into these various groups. Calhoun also stated that these qualities mirroring his behavioral sink could be seen in large cities, such as Detroit or Baltimore, that had specific areas that were central to where all the crime was going on, more than other areas, and where taboo behavior was permitted to happen more regularly than the rest of the city. Now, going into my non-experiment, this is to do with Fordlandia. Fordlandia was the fantastic brainchild of the infamous Henry Ford, who made a hefty fortune on his eponymous motor car company, upon encountering a number of issues that made a crucial resource cars rely on, which is rubber, or latex. At the time, synthetic rubber was not available. The prices of rubber coming from Southeast Asia were high because of competitors, and most of Ford's supply relied on farmers in South America who had ventured deep into the jungle to find these sparsely located and really, spaced out rubber latex trees when they were in season, and glean what rubber and latex they could. So having grown up on a farm and seeing agricultural cultivation as the main staple of a healthy American family, Ford proceeded to buy up a great deal of land, like millions of acres, in a financial agreement with the Brazilian government in South America, and Ford proceeded to hire a great deal of American workers who agreed to move their families to this brave new world. Upon the arrival of multiple boats and cargo ships, the millions of acres now under Ford's domain were extensively cleared to make room for the planting of rubber trees. Ford somehow reached the conclusion that these trees could be farmed like any other major agricultural product, so essentially just rows of trees, rows of rubber trees. He just made the assumption that this would work, but his ignorance of the indigenous trees' requirements for survival and those environmental factors that contributed to their survival and allowed them to flourish would something that would come back to haunt him. Otherwise, Fordlandia was a picturesque cut and paste of an ideal American suburb, only these burbs were in the middle of the world's largest jungle that is host to so many species of animals that there is thought to be hundreds of thousands of creatures that have not yet been identified. Multiple American and Brazilian workers Ford hired had died in the process of developing Ford's ideal world from disease, venomous bites from the Amazon's critters, and so on, but the prospect of double wages was just enough to get these overwrought workers to continue. Another issue with Ford's ideal world is the stringent morality that Ford enforced upon people, which included but was not limited to no alcohol, only married couples, no smoking, no engaging in any form of recreational activity that wasn't traditionally American. So that meant no Brazilians could play soccer. You could only play baseball. Mandatory poetry readings, forcing his own dietary preferences upon people, as Ford was a vegetarian, so meat was not provided to workers, and these workers also had to punch in and out of a massive time clock that Ford had constructed for employees, so they could put in a full day's labor, but if they didn't punch in and out, it wouldn't count for anything. And so it was because of these rigid conditions, as well as just the fact that this was the Amazon, not rural America, which is why things started to fail fairly quickly. So more of a highly conservative man made the only recreational area for the working community of all things square dancing hole. And this especially was not something the Brazilian workers were too fond of. Now, workers finally had enough of this regimental lifestyle, and it began to wear them down. First, they tossed the cafeteria in a riot and chased the American chef into the jungle, destroyed the massive time clock that ruled over the fate of their wages, and with the rubber trees dying from such a close proximity to one another, which allowed parasitic caterpillars that fed on the rubber trees to just proliferate like crazy, his experiment ended up crumbling down, and despite Ford never relenting and claiming it was always a worthy venture, despite it almost bankrupting him, it was one of the first assets that Ford's son, heir apparent, had auctioned off for a meager sum compared to what his father had spent once he inherited his estate. So my conclusion is that from Calhoun's rat Utopia to the rise and fall of the highly ambiguous yet austerely, morally disciplined disaster that was Fordlandia, there is ample proof that too many people who have too much can be a potentially precarious thing, that if a contained populated area were to have such features, it is crucial that the societal role of everyone is clearly defined and agreed upon by the inhabitants of said area. Forcing moral standards that works for some and not all is a recipe for disaster. No matter how opulently the resources may flow, as without a sense of social identity, the consequential lack of meaning to the individual that comes with being forced into a mold can have disastrous results. Now that concludes my project, and I can provide any citations upon request. Thank you. Goodbye.